Hello viewers and welcome to another episode of the Lord of the Rings The Card Game Progression Series. My name is Mitch.
And my name is Matthew.
And now that we've discussed every card and completed every scenario, from the core set through the entire Shadows of Mirkwood cycle, we've finished our first full expansion block for LOTR LCG. Throughout the lifespan of this living card game, our developers generally follow a pattern of releasing new products in the form of one large or deluxe expansion box, followed up by a series or cycle of 6 subsequent adventure packs. Each big box expansion generally introduces several unique new themes, trends, and game mechanics, and the preceding AP cycle of 6 small, mostly monthly expansions serves to expand upon and explore those novel experiences further. Just like every deluxe expansion, each adventure pack contains several new player cards, and even though each individual pack is released one at a time to the player base, each cycle's new options for deck building are always designed together as one set and then divvied up between adventure packs, as our design team feels is appropriate. While each new scenario within each adventure pack generally includes encounter sets that made their debut in the initial large box release of a given expansion block, for our first adventure pack cycle, there was no prior deluxe expansion to draw from. So instead, the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle included encounter cards taken from the core set. So, when Matthew and I sat down to deck build for each of the SOM quests, we had no more than the core set and Shadows of Mirkwood cycle cards at our disposal when it came to planning what we wanted to play for each scenario. But because the progression series assesses and plays through each expansion product individually over the course of several weeks, whenever Matthew and I do conclude a full expansion block, it should make for an interesting and engaging discussion to go back and overview the block as a whole. And that's what we're going to be doing for the first time today. So, Matthew, let's talk about our overall impressions and opinions of all of the cards encompassing the core set plus Shadows of Mirkwood cycle block. You and I intend to talk about player cards first, in regard to the introduction and development of the 4 spheres of influence, and we'll also discuss the advent and evolution of the various traits. We'll share our experiences playing through each of this game's first 9 quests, and touch on how we've developed and changed over time as players ourselves, both in regard to our deck building styles and strategies in-game. As always, I strongly encourage anyone listening to please share your own opinions on anything that Matthew and I discussed today in the comments, because no matter when you're listening to this episode, the modern progression series is designed to be essentially timeless. Therefore, any comments you leave will help contribute to the enlightenment and entertainment of past, present, and future members of our cooperative living card game community alike. But, Matthew, let's start off by talking about the 4 disparate spheres of influence, what they originally looked like in the core set, and how, if at all, they had changed by the end of Shadows of Mirkwood. And let's begin with leadership. As we discussed in the very first evaluation video of this new progression series, several trends or themes are immediately evident the very moment that one cracks open the core set. Leadership cards originally focused on providing benefits to the players such as action advantage, which is to say giving characters the ability to do more during a single game round than they could ever otherwise do. Leadership as a sphere also emphasized emphasizes resource acceleration, which allows for playing more, or more expensive, cards during one turn than would normally be possible, and leadership cards tend to benefit multiple targets simultaneously. Leadership effects often confer benefits when characters leave play, and overall, leadership characters tend to exhibit relatively balanced statistics, excelling at neither combat nor questing, but instead managing to do both reasonably well. All the same, I've mentioned before that I think what best illustrates the specialties of a given sphere of influence are its unique characters more often than not. So, in looking at the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle player cards, let's begin with the heroes. So, Matthew, I can scarcely think of a better place to begin our discussion. So, who were the new leadership heroes introduced in the Mirkwood block? And what do you think they add to, alter, or exemplify about the leadership sphere?
Well, the two new leadership heroes in the cycle itself were Prince Imrahil and Dane Ironfoot. And to me, Prince Imrahil is the sort of obvious logical extension of the core set. In many ways, he's various core set leadership cards rolled into one. I think in our review of him, we said he's fairly similar to Aragorn, but he also brings cards like Ever Vigilant or Common Cause to mind. Not exactly the same, but sort of in the same vein.
Sure.
On the other hand, we get Dane Ironfoot, and in some ways he's not really an extension of the core set in that he is very trait-specific towards dwarves, and dwarf characters are few and far between in the core set in Shadows of Mirkwood. But where he is similar is that he gives a global boost. So boosting attack or willpower strength, which is not uncommon in the first cycle of leadership cards. So all in all, I think they're a good addition to our leadership team.
They're definitely interesting. They add some additional options. Prince Imrahil really exemplifies the whole action advantage thing perfectly, and we're going to be talking about trends and patterns, and the Mirkwood cycle has a whole hell of a lot of different characters that involve you discarding them intentionally from play to derive some benefit from that, and of course characters just leave play through being destroyed, being beaten by enemies. Dane Ironfoot does kind of seem a little bit strange just because there are effects that are trait specific, like for Gondor, that provide additional attack, potentially additional defense, but he does seem a little bit strange. I guess it's nice that we have Glowin and Brock Ironfist in the leadership sphere, but Prince Imrahil, it seems like he's going to end up being reliant on a lot of spirit characters that can maybe be discarded, and then they leave play. And Dane, there aren't so many dwarves in the leadership sphere where you're going to be able to, really run him and get a considerable benefit just, in like a monosphere deck. So Prince Imrahil, it was almost strange at first because he is just so similar to Aragorn, but certainly I've got a soft spot in my heart for Dane, and it's just nice to see, in some ways, these heroes both kind of pay tribute to what leadership should all be about, but they do take it kind of in a unique direction, and it's very nice that Imrahil isn't just a straight-up clone of Aragorn. But just as we're talking about all of these cards, all the player cards anyway, some stuff to consider are, do you think of any of these cards as keepers or standouts? Because this game has been going on for 6 or so years, and as Matthew and I are sitting down to record this episode, the latest deluxe expansion is Sands of Harad, and we're yet to break into the Haradrim cycle. I mean, do any of these kind of hold up over time? And as we're starting to see our core set card pool evolve, do they compensate for any weaknesses present in the core set? Like, I guess in my opinion, Prince Imrahil, it's nice that when you lose characters, he can kind of compensate for that, but I mean, just characters dying is kind of it's not so much like a weakness of the core set, it's just kind of like a fact of LOTR LCG. But, I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, so your last question, I think I'll take that one first, which is, does this sort of fill in the gaps of the core set? And when I was reviewing the leadership cards of the core set, it just reminds me of what we said in our original Progression Series video a couple years ago about this particular sphere, and that is, it really truly is the jack of all trades. And every time I go back to leadership core cards, I'm reminded of how much readying there actually is. I think because Unexpected Courage from the Spirit Sphere is so powerful and relatively cheap and just frankly ubiquitous, I forget that the Leadership Sphere has so much of it. Aragorn, of course, but Grim Resolve. For example, I already mentioned Ever Vigilant. Even Common Cause, to a degree, is a form of readying. There's lots of direct damage, whether it's Longbeard Orc Slayer, right? There's willpower boosting with Celebrian Stone or Faramir. There's engagement with Son of Arnor. All sorts of things that the other spheres do. Card draw with Valiant Sacrifice, or the new card from the cycle, Campfire Tales. So it really kind of just does a little bit of everything, but doesn't quite excel at it as much as the other three spheres do. So in that vein, I think the Shadow of Mirkwood's cards just build on that. We've got ways to boost attack strength, defense strength, or willpower strength with the signal cards. We've got more card draw with Campfire Tales, as I mentioned. So, I don't know. I think the cards are decent. I'm not so sure it fills in any gaps per se, but rather just expounds upon the idea that leadership, at least in the first cycle, really is the jack of all trades.
Yeah, it seems like kind of a lot of the core set cards are almost a grab bag. We're going to talk about traits later on, and it's like, here's a sprinkling of this, and here's a sprinkling of that, and here's a handful of these action advantage cards with a little bit of resource acceleration and all sorts of stuff like that, but it's a lot of disparate effects kind of coming together in one sphere. Lore is probably the poster boy for a sphere that, at least in the core set, was really kind of struggling to find some sort of identity, but leadership is all over the place as well. You kind of touched on the Mirkwood cycle cards, and each sphere saw 12 new player cards. You talked about, the signals and Campfire Tales specifically. How do you perceive those as differing from what we saw in the core set? Like, to me, they add a lot of new options. Like, we started to see a little bit of shadow cancellation with Dunedain Watcher and Dawn Take You All, something that previously we'd only seen with Spirit. But it kind of provided a little bit more shape for leadership. Like, it seems that leadership has a lot to do with helping other players, and the signals kind of take care of that. But, I mean, for all the kind of goofy cards and semi-useful cards we saw from the Mirkwood set, like, do any of those hold up today? You and I deck build, but some of these, it seems like in our evaluation videos, we kind of have to think of a lot more positive things to say about them than they maybe deserve.
Yeah, the beginning of this game was rough, to put it mildly. Just getting to 50 cards for a deck, particularly if you're using a single sphere, was very, very challenging. So basically you threw everything in, and then each adventure pack, you kind of just added some more, because it was difficult to get to 50 with just the core set. And yet most of these cards really didn't wow you or make your deck that much better. I'm not so sure the next cycle makes that much better. But after that cycle, I think it gets a little bit easier. But it took a couple of years before we could finally say, now I've got some deck building options. And really, now I've got some deck building options that aren't the same as everyone else playing the game. The only cards to me that hold up, the heroes accepted, are Dunedain Mark, Campfire Tales, and Dunedain Warning. I don't really see any of the rest of these cards played with great frequency. Certainly, I think some of them are decent sideboard cards, maybe Dunedain Cash or Dunedain Signal, maybe the Dunedain Watcher or Dawn Take You All. But outside of that, I don't think we got a lot of stellar options here. even if some of them are useful. But again, Dunedain Mark, Dunedain Warning, it's never the most exciting draw, even if you do, want a slightly better defender or slightly better attacker. It's always helpful, but it's not like, oh my god, I gotta get that Dunedain Warning. So the heroes are good, and I think Prince Imrahil remains in play to this day. Dane Ironfoot, there was such dwarf overload and overkill. I think it's not played today, but it's really largely because of the timing of releases. I mentioned that in another video. If the Hobbit sagas hadn't have come out when they did, I don't think we would have been so burnt out on the dwarves. They were also the first sort of powered deck, I think, and so in that sense, again, just sort of burnout and overkill with them. But, if you were to go back and build a dwarf deck, maybe it's fun again if you've taken a few years off of it. So, all in all, I'll probably have similar thoughts for all of the spheres. Does it expand leadership? Yes. Does it make for exciting deck building options after the conclusion of our first cycle? No, not really.
Yeah, I certainly will say, like, Prince Imrahil, what's kind of exciting, and not to date this episode, but we've started to see some cards that are kind of revisiting heroes that were introduced and they never became tremendously popular. I've never been much of a monosphere player, so when I go to pick a leadership hero, generally I've got options that I select before Prince Imrahil. But since we're going to be doing this new progression series chronologically, we're going to be opening up our Khazad-dûm Deluxe expansion, going through the entire Dwaro-Delph cycle, opening up the Hobbit Overhill and Underhill and the Hobbit on the Doorstep. And just like you said, that is a metric ton of dwarves, so Dane Ironfoot is definitely a superstar for a while, but then eventually the dwarves are kind of pulled, yanked out of the spotlight, and other decks get their time to shine. But I do look forward to using Dane quite a lot. Here and there, Prince Imrahil will see a little bit of use as well, but I just thought it was funny how in these 12 Shadows of Mirkwood cycle leadership player cards, it's kind of the vanilla cards that are the staples, like Dunedain Mark is +2 attack, Warning is +2 defense, Campfire Tales, everybody draws a card, there's no real parting gifts being used. Keen-Eyed Took, as much as I'd like him to function, he just kind of doesn't, but it's almost like this unspoken rule that while every card might have its corner case use scenario, like Dawn Take You All, is in some cases pretty cool. You can work around shadow effects that you can't traditionally cancel. It just seems like a lot of these cards are more trouble than they're worth. Like, I think of the tactics card Song of Mocking when I think of a card that's just way too much effort to get it to function. Like, Dunedain Cash can give ranged, Dunedain Signal can give Sentinel, but as we get more and more cards, we start to see characters that already have printed ranged or already have printed Sentinel. So it's like, if I can just run a character that always has that effect, why would I want to introduce that random element where I might not have the card, that I need at the time? So not a ton of these cards are keepers for me. Even the Dunedain stuff I'm not a huge fan of. But just in going back and looking at all of this stuff, things like Rear Guard, I think just having improved as a player, I certainly think some of these cards are much better than I once thought they were. But let's keep this discussion moving right along, and let's break open our tactics sphere. So in the core set, tactics was all about, weapons and armor, direct damage, not healing, but, preventing attacks, like through feint, boosting your combat-relevant stats, like attack and defense, and of course they were terrible at questing, and we also saw some benefits from destroying enemies, like Legolas could generate progress tokens, and so could your kind of beloved Blade of Gondolin. But again, starting with our heroes, who were those and what did they do, if anything, for tactics?
Well, the two new heroes were Brand, Son of Bane, and Boromir. So, as far as most players are concerned, polar opposites on the spectrum of usefulness. Boromir ranking near the top, perhaps overpowered. Brand, Son of Bane being binder fodder almost from the moment he was released. I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I'm a Brand fan, although I'm often the fan of the underdog. And whereas Boromir, because he was so hot and sexy and everyone wanted to play him, I have never used his card version, at least physical card. Mitch corrected me the other day saying, I did indeed use him once in a progression series video, but I can say I've never used the physical card, as if that really means anything. With that said, tactics to me in the core set was very focused, as you just mentioned, much more so than leadership, in that it was about boosting attack, boosting defense, or negating enemy attacks in some way, shape, or form. And so these two heroes don't directly deal with that. But to me, they naturally feel tactics, I guess. They fit within the sphere. I don't find them to be abnormal. Brand really can be an MVP in multiplayer games. The ability to ready heroes cannot be overstated. And his ability really, really is good. Boromir, speaking of, readies himself. Of course, you have to pay for threat. At this time in the game's life, reducing threat is difficult. It's really, limited to the spirit sphere. And so you have to have ways to mitigate his ability. But I would say two pretty solid entries into our hero lineup.
I think much more so than Prince Imrahil. Like, Prince Imrahil was fine when he came out. You saw all of the spirit stuff and all of the Rohan stuff incentivizing you to have characters leave play, and Imrahil obviously readies in response to that. And once upon a time, Horn of Gondor generated resources in response to that. Brand and Boromir both seem like plants that maybe they didn't sprout or blossom right away, but eventually, once the card pool really starts to expand, they get out of control very quickly. In anything approximating like a more modern card pool, when you get more and more options for boosting attack and defense, Boromir starts to shine. Eventually, threat reduction kind of becomes not like a joke, but much more of a joke than it is now. And once you see more and more characters that have abilities that require exhaustion, Brand starts to become more and more compelling. Tactics was always so laser focused on comment, kind of to the lamentation of many core set players, they weren't able to do like the solo tactics deck. Brand, even though he's got 2 willpower, wasn't exactly able to like reverse that, but it just blows me away how crappy Brand seemed in the core set context, and even Boromir didn't wow me, but nowadays there are so many, just the card pool is so deep, there are so many combo pieces available, both of those characters end up being tremendously powerful. It's just a bit of a shame that it's going to be a while into this new series before we see Brand and Boromir truly come into their own. The leadership cards were kind of all over the place in regard to this increases questing ability, this increases combat ability, here's some card draw, here's some readying, here's Keen-Eyed Took, here's this and here's that. The 12 player cards for tactics seem like they have much more of an identity, but Matthew, what do you think about those?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. There really is an identity, and there's one. Eagles. Yeah, we get Beorning Beekeeper, but there is no Beorning synergy at this point in time. Who knows if there ever will be. Song of Mocking, there is a song synergy at some point in the game's life, but this doesn't really fit into too much the synergy. In fact, the best hero it could probably go on is Glowin, not really a tactics hero. The rest of the cards, in some way, shape, or form, deal with eagles, and so it's a lot of eagle love. With that said, there's only 2 to me that really stand the test of time. That would be Vassal of the Windlord and Wing Guardian. They are going to be in many a tactics deck from now until at least the end of the Heirs of Numenor and its related cycle quests. Support of the Eagle certainly has some fans, particularly with Boromir later on in the game's life. It's not a card I've ever really gotten to work, in large part because of its cost. Landreval becomes helpful with certain heroes that we'll get in some Saga expansions in the future. But Descendant of Thorndor a bit expensive, Beorning Beekeeper expensive. We've talked about the Eagle events a lot. In most cases, not worth it. Same thing with Eagles of Misty Mountains. Really cool in theory, but in practice it never gets boosted up all that much, and all you end up doing with it is quest. So I think Vassal and Winged Guardian are fantastic. I still think they're great today if you have sort of a general tactics deck and you're not trying to fit any particular theme and you need to throw in some cheap willpower, or I'm sorry, cheap attack strength or cheap defense strength. Don't use these guys for willpower. But, they're going to be pretty good. In fact, they're going to be very good for their cost. But the rest of the cards, pretty much dead on arrival, and I think they're probably still dead to this day, unfortunately.
Yeah, kind of again, it's the simpler the better. It's kind of the conservative cards that really do withstand the test of time. Winged Guardian, Vassal of the Windlord, they're not terribly exciting, but they are very efficient based on their stats. There's a lot of stuff that involves returning cards to hand, like Born Aloft and, God forbid, Meneldor's Flight, but a lot of these cards are just so expensive they kind of strike me as traps almost. Like when you're struggling to make a 50 card deck, that's fine. They're, more excusable to include in decks. If you're running mono tactics, you're much more likely to be able to fund Eagles in the Misty Mountain and Support of the Eagles and Landreval, Descendant of Thorondor, blah, blah, blah. It just seems like there's a ton of cool potential, but the likelihood that a lot of these expensive effects are going to pay off is probably pretty low, and as fun as it is to make kind of cute little cheeky decks, for better or worse, I always err on the side of consistency and power and efficiency over, there was an article once upon a time that took the Magic the Gathering player archetypes and kind of converted them into more Middle-earthen terms. It was like the Boromir player is the win at any cost, and the Pippin player is the cute combo deck, and the Bilbo player is akin to Magic's Vorthos player, where you like theme and lore and fluff and the fiction above everything else. And a lot of these tactics cards, as strange as it is, like you'd think of tactics being like brainless killing, but it just seems like there's a lot of Pippin style stuff going on. Descendant of Thorondor is cool, where you can drop it into play, damage an enemy, remove it from the battlefield, damage an enemy again, but that's just too unreliable, too finicky. It's just, in my opinion, more often than not worth the risk. Like, certainly you can get these cards to work. Sneak Attack and Steward of Gondor can make Eagles of the Misty Mountain and Support of the Eagles trivial to get into play. It just seems like generally those effects are better spent elsewhere, and it just seems like there's a lot of kind of win more stuff, and I guess once we kind of move on from the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle, even though the Eagle trait is cool, and it certainly gets a whole hell of a lot of love here, it's almost like abandoned completely.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, but it's just a bit of a bummer that not a ton of these cards are going to see love moving forward. And last thing I wanted to mention is like Song of Mocking makes me think of Dane Ironfoot, where certain cards are synergistic and certain cards give you a benefit just because they have like a printed trait. Like every time a dwarf card is released, we have to say, well, with Dane Ironfoot in play, it gets +1 willpower, +1 attack.
Right.
Every time, a song comes out from now on, it's like, eventually, if you play this card, you will gain 1 resource or something like that. So I don't necessarily know if it's like they're worth thinking of them as like a synergy, as it is, it's just kind of like an arbitrary thing. But I suppose let's keep moving on to Spirit. In the core set, they were terrible at combat, but they had very high willpower. Think of Eowyn. You could put out progress tokens through card effects. You could reduce your threat. You could cancel shadow cards. You could cancel when revealed effects. And there were some cards that allowed you to recur things or put stuff back into play, like Stand and Fight and Fortune or Fate resurrects allies and heroes respectively, and Dwarven Tomb allows you to kind of bounce any spirit card back to your hand. Previously, leadership and tactics each saw 2 heroes. This time it's just 1. So before talking about the player cards, who's the Mirkwood hero?
So we get Frodo. And I think if any sphere is only going to get one, he's a pretty good hero to have one of, in the sense that I think he's really good, and he fills a niche, or fills a hole, rather, that the core set left for this particular sphere, which was defense. It really didn't have a ton of great options, and Frodo was one of those. Now, granted, your threat's going to skyrocket, but of the spheres, Spirit is best at handling that. So I think Frodo is a very welcomed addition, not only to the sphere, but to the game in general. He really makes a lot of decks work, even if you're not running a ton of Spirit.
Yeah, I totally have to agree. It seemed like in the core set, undefended attacks killing heroes was kind of the bane of everyone's existence, and we had a nice long delay between the core set and the Hunt for Gollum, our first adventure pack, and then it was just a matter of time before we saw Conflict at the Carrack come out, and inside was Frodo Baggins. So there were plenty of times when I was swamped by enemies, undefended attack happened, heroes die, and then I lose the game. But Frodo all of a sudden provides a nice alternative to not just Spirit decks, but, throughout the series, many times we've seen you, the reasonably high threat, primarily tactics player, really get a big, considerable benefit from Frodo. And if you're just looking to splash a hero into a deck to get access to cancellation, unexpected courage, all sorts of good stuff like that, Frodo, it's really hard to say no to him. So he does some cool stuff, incredibly low threat, which was nice after seeing Bilbo Baggins at a whopping 9 for a 2 HP character, and he's got some pretty decent willpower. Again, very welcome in a tactics deck, primarily tactics deck. But we once again see 12 new player cards. They've got a reasonably clear identity, but Matthew, what do you think about those? What's your opinion?
Yeah, much like Tactics, the identity here is very focused, and that is Rohan. There's very few cards that are not focused on Rohan, and in fact, Ancient Matham would be the one that isn't. So, I've been playing a Rohan deck for years, in large part because I'm too lazy to build a new deck, and haven't really had a lot of inspiration with the new cycles, I'm sad to admit, to want to build a new deck. With that said, the vast majority of these are not in my current iteration of a Rohan deck, at least when it comes to the events. They're expensive, and they're just not really worth the cost. The allies, I think, are all in my deck, either as 1, 2, or 3 ofs. So the allies, I think, stand the test of time, but it's going to be a very long time until Rohan comes into its own. We get a couple cycles down the road that visits Isengard in the Rohan area, but we actually don't get a ton of characters from there. It'll be the Lord of the Rings saga expansions, I think, that really bring Rohan into its own. So we get a lot of these Rohan cards, but the deck never quite works this early on, which again is a recurring theme. Eagles didn't quite work. Rohan doesn't quite work. I'm not sure it addresses any of the deficiencies from the core set. It certainly gives us some interesting options. To borrow a phrase from myself, it's a mixed bag. I think the hero is a knockout win. I think the Spirit core set cards are great in many ways. Most of them are very good. They remain staples to this day. The heroes are very sort of, I think, endemic of the sphere, with the exception of Dunehir, the Rohan hero. Eowyn, of course, is a Rohan hero too, but Dunehir is sort of an oddball. He's got to attack alone. Spirit doesn't have a natural way to boost that. The vast majority of these cards, in fact, all of these cards that we got that are Rohan-esque in the cycle, don't do anything to help Dunehir attack better. So you're kind of like, well, goodness, you've got a Rohan hero, but I want to attack with him, I don't want to quest with him, and yet all these cards boost questing. So it's just, again, one of those things where we put all of these cards in our decks back in, 2011, 2012, but only because we didn't really have any other option. So I think some of them have become good later, as you mentioned. The cool thing about a living card game is there going to be a really crappy card, or a card that maybe is good, but not with the other cards that exist. And 2, 3, 4 years down the road, it's like, now this guy has a use. Now I can maybe make him work. And I think a lot of these cards are that way. And my opinion on them really won't change for, a couple of cycles and saga expansions to come.
Yes, I think one of the cards that maybe most exemplifies what you're talking about is that Nor Am I a Stranger, where when it first came out, just the attached character gains the Rohan trait. That really doesn't mean a whole hell of a lot, but
Right.
someday maybe it means like, when you're committing to the quest, you don't exhaust and you get bonuses to willpower, or when you destroy an enemy, you add progress, where all of a sudden, one resource and a card is doing a lot for a character. But back in the day, that wasn't really the case. I think and this is kind of difficult to say, or it's hard to think of a way to articulate this thought, but you and I, at least in the progression series, we're always playing 2-player games. But I think in a 3 or 4-player environment, Rohan, again back in the day, starts to become more acceptable, where each deck can maybe focus on just fulfilling one role. So it's almost like these cards are just slightly too weak to be featured in like a 1 or 2-player environment where your deck really has to be efficient and powerful to give you a chance to win. But if you have kind of the luxury of focusing on questing and ensuring that location lock doesn't become a thing, then it's much more justifiable to use like the Rittermark's Finest and Ride to Ruin to snipe susceptible locations while they're sitting there in the staging area. I think it does kind of hurt, obviously, that Northern Tracker is so strong. It kind of overshadows both of those cards I just mentioned. But in 3-4 player games, location lock can be such a difficult thing to kind of overcome. Maybe those are worth including in a deck. And as you and I are going to be doing moving forward, there are plenty of scenarios where Rittermark's Finest is just what I don't know, Istari ordered when it comes to sniping like a 4-threat 2-progress token location prior to quest resolution. But apart from that, we don't have enough Rohan characters all focused into the spirit sphere to really make a lot of these effects worthwhile. Like a We Do Not Sleep, where until the end of the phase, Rohan characters do not exhaust to commit to quests. That's good, theoretically, but they don't have like the combat prowess to back it up. And Astonishing Speed, again, a big willpower boost is great, but your deck probably doesn't have the luxury of spending 3 spirit resources on a card like that.
Yeah.
So Ancient Matham kind of stands up because it's kind of a brainless explore a location, draw a ton of cards. But for all this other stuff, like mustering the Rohirrim, Aelmond, none of these Rohan cards are so like critical to winning a game that you need to get them as quickly as possible.
Yeah. My overall thought, and I think I mean this, and I might contradict myself at some point in the future, so don't hold me to it, is that the early, meaning it's a sort of off the cuff thought, that the early life of the game, we either get vanilla cards that end up being staples, or we get cards that are sort of mediocre and be more powerful later, and then the final third would be win more cards. And I think Spirit gets a lot of the win more sort of stuff, like Astonishing Speed or We Do Not Sleep. My God, 3 and 5 resources, so ridiculously expensive. Now, are their effects very powerful? Undoubtedly. I don't think it's debatable. But with that said, if you've got 5 resources to spare, one of 2 things are happening. You have nothing good in your hand to play, so you piled up 5 resources, which means you're not a very good deck builder, sorry to say. Or you have so many resources, you're just flush with Steward of Gondor or something because it's mid to late game, and you don't need the extra willpower anyway. And so this game, to me, suffers a lot of that sort of deck building crisis, I guess, where it's, sort of the boring, plain vanilla stuff or the win more stuff, neither of which you really want to top deck. You want to draw, and it's going to get you out of a jam. There's very few cards that I would say sort of find the sweet spot between vanilla boring and win more that really help you out of a bind. And in the early life of the game, we really get boring, not that helpful, or way too expensive, but super powerful, and neither one really help you out of a ton of situations, meaning the player can't adapt all that quickly to what the encounter deck is throwing its way. So eventually that changes, but I think this first cycle and maybe even the next are really endemic of that sort of style of card design that we don't see so much with the current design team.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so many people consider Snowborn Scout to be one of the better cards in the game for a very long time, and it's like, well, it's a one-resource ally, and it sits there, and that's basically that. So many cards, our impression for as exhaustively as I can talk about a card, my opinion generally boils down to, for a lot of these, like, it's cool, but totally impractical, or it's boring, but it's efficient and good. So I think I totally agree with you there, and I think I might propose a fourth category, which is cards that initially seem bad, and they never become good. But yeah, so not a lot of these cards get used by me moving forward, but I think when the original Progression series ended was near the end of the Against the Shadow cycle. And that's kind of my reference point for, how far in advance my knowledge of the card pool goes, where you're right up to, I suppose we haven't seen any of the APs yet, but that Sans, or the Herodrum cycle. So, why don't we go ahead and talk about lore? Matthew, I believe this is maybe your personal favorite sphere. So, in the core set, lore was all about healing, card draw, scrying, and kind of managing encounter cards in the staging area and that just interplay. So it's not like canceling shadow effects and when revealed effects, but it's Forest Snare, which stops an enemy from attacking. It's Miner of the Iron Hills that removes condition attachments from play, and not reducing threat, but kind of managing or mitigating threat, like Secret Paths, Location's threat is 0, or Radagast's Cunning, an enemy's threat is 0. And there was also a pretty significant focus on defense in that we saw Denethor, the first, 3 defense value hero. So this is another instance where the sphere just got one new hero. But Matthew, take it away, and who did lore get?
Well, before I get into that, I want to address one of your comments there, which is lore being my favorite sphere. I don't know how I've gotten the reputation that I'm a lore holder or a lore hater. Certainly, it's undeserved. Regardless of anything I've ever said, I don't need you to send me the videos and the timestamps. But let me say this: you mentioned player styles earlier, or player archetypes. I have been replaying the Final Fantasy series because I've actually, believe it or not, had quite a bit of time off work. I just beat Final Fantasy 1 yesterday. I've played it a million times before, but I'm replaying it. And I'm going...
And not to cut you off, but that is hands down my favorite game of all time.
Well, I'm playing through Final Fantasy 2 as we speak. Again, I've beaten everything up through 7, and I've never finished any of them post that. I'm just a fan of the old school NES or SNES Final Fantasies. Anywho, in playing those games, and believe me, I'll make a connection to Lord of the Rings here in a second. The fighters are my favorite. I love the cool swords. I love the cool armor. Getting a new spell, I'm always like, meh. But my God, are those white mages important? You gotta have the healing, right? You've got to be able to cure those status effects. I appreciate their role in Final Fantasy, but I want that cool new sword. And I'm very much the same way in Lord of the Rings. I want someone to be giving me card draw. I want someone to be healing my characters. I even like Tenemarth and Return to Mirkwood, scrying and counter deck all the time. I just don't want to be that player. So to set the record straight, I really appreciate white mages / the lore sphere. It's just not my preferred playstyle. It doesn't excite me like finding Excalibur in Final Fantasy 1. So, with that said, the hero of this particular sphere, we only get one, and I think it's a decent one. Probably underrated, but maybe understandably so. Good old Bilbo Baggins. He fits with the theme of lore very nicely, where you get to draw a card, and in fact, he gets to spread the love. So the first player always gets to draw one. I think if any character deserves a new version of the hero, it's probably Bilbo. But I don't know. I like him. I understand that his threat is probably too high given his ability, but I still think it's a pretty good one.
Yeah, so back in the day, he was totally reasonable. More card draw is never a bad thing. Nowadays, especially, I do wish that that 9 was upside down and made into a 6 for his threat cost, but would that have been broken back in the day? Maybe so. The difference between 9 and 6 is awfully significant. Back when everybody was, like, critically wanting to keep their starting threat under 30 to avoid hill trolls at any and all cost. But Bilbo was fine. Some people to this day absolutely love the fellow. One of those Mirkwood block cards is a Burning Brand. We've already talked about Dunedain Warning. Some people kind of combine the two and make him into some super defender that eventually can kind of, instead of trying to engage Smog in some sort of like riddle and English contest, he just kind of stands there and the dragon attacks and attacks, and little Bilbo is just totally insurmountable and practically indestructible. So he's a very cool character. He doesn't exactly fit my personal playstyle, and I wouldn't exactly say that Matthew and I are that similar in regard to, our play style preferences, but certainly I look more toward efficiency and raw power and practicality and consistency, so I'm more likely to go with Barivore, where you're picking who draws cards. I'm more likely to go for chump blockers over, God, I really hope I draw a Burning Brand. God, I really hope I draw 2 to 3 copies of Dunedain Warning as quickly as possible. So I'm not a huge fan of Bilbo, but, he's a cool character. He was our very first expansion hero, so, rose-colored glasses are very much a thing. So he's fine, not remarkable.
Generally speaking, I think I agree with you in terms of how to build a deck. But the problem with the core set, and perhaps more so the Shadows of Mirkwood, is they don't give us those options. So oftentimes you are praying that you're going to top deck a Burning Brand, or Dunedain Mark or Dunedain Warning, because there's nothing better. The allies aren't going to help you out much more. Now, as the game evolves, even into Khazad-dûm and against the Shadow, we do get more options and better options. But at this point in time, there's not much. Again, like the other 3 spheres, there aren't a lot of cards here that I think stand the test of time. Burning Brand is a card that remains relevant for a long time, although I don't really see anyone use it today. Haldir and Gildor are interesting, and I see them used in particular decks, typically those decks using a card called A Very Good Tale that we're not going to get for quite a while. But straight out paying for them, I don't really see people do that. So really the only card that I think consistently gets use out of all of these is Fast Hitch. A great card if you're playing Hobbit decks. They've never particularly appealed to me, but if you are, it's an almost necessary card, particularly because it's so cheap. The rest of these, I think the Rivendell Minstrel remains important if and when songs are important, which is really just the first cycle or 2, and then it becomes much easier to smooth the resources amongst spheres, and songs really diminish in their power and their necessity. So I think of all the spheres, I think this one has the most duds, and that I'd really only rate one card to staple, Fast Hitch, and that's only for Hobbits, with a Burning Brand second place, but again, it soon loses its oomph a couple cycles down the road.
So I've got a few different thoughts here. You happen to mention, hoping that you top deck a Burning Brand or something like that. Like you just pray that the heart of the cards is with you and you draw into that thing you really need. Kind of a bummer that I've noticed throughout playing these Shadows of Mirkwood cycle scenarios and sitting there editing our videos and listening to myself and you talk, again and again, is so often we'll have one player draw a bunch of cards through Barivore and or Gleowine and or Ancient Matham, and we might draw 7 cards in one turn, and we'll say something like, oh, I only drew garbage. So it just kind of says a lot about the quality of the card pool here. A lot of these cards, I respect them for their situational or corner case or context specific uses. Like Rivendell Minstrel, if you've got songs that you need, that's great. Strider's Path, like Conflict at the Carrick. There's a chance that you might draw a location that gets a giant threat bonus because there are trolls in play. But if you can travel to that location automatically, you don't need to be subjected to that. If you've got to worry about shadow cards where your enemies are getting additional attacks or something, then a Burning Brand is, perfect. Infighting could situationally be fine. Gildor's Council, if you're up against some total nightmare of an encounter deck, maybe that's pretty good. Sylvan Tracker, again, very specific in only healing Sylvan characters. And Mirkwood Runner, because it bypasses defense, but it's got really low attack strength, and it can only attack by itself to get that ability, there aren't a ton of situations where it's going to be, like, globally useful. So a lot of these cards just kind of strike me as awfully sideboardy, to borrow a term from you.
I was just thinking that. So you took the words right out of my head.
Right. And then, some of these are a bit of a luxury, like Haldir and Gildor are great statistically, but they're so expensive that until we see a way to kind of cheat them into play, they're great, but they're just not practical, as I was mentioning earlier. So these cards are interesting, but I've got to say, out of all the cycles we've seen, as much as I'm not blown away by all the Rohan stuff for Spirit, these are maybe my least favorite. I just think it's always fun to get exciting, unique characters, and lore offers up some, and then Fast Hitch, eventually, when we see a Hobbit deck. That's a pretty, just irreplaceable card. But I suppose let's keep moving along and talk about our neutral cards. In the core set, it was pretty simple, albeit versatile. We got Gandalf, 4 attack, 4 willpower, 4 defense, 4 hit points. He can lower your threat. He can deal damage directly. He can draw you cards. Whatever area of weakness your deck had, albeit for a cost of 5, he could very much compensate for. I suppose, what did we see in regard to neutral cards in the Shadows of Mirkwood?
Yeah, I've already mentioned the songs, and they're as unexciting as a card gets. I think you see a decent amount of play with the songs in the first cycle, maybe also the second cycle, and I don't see anyone use them anymore. Again, as I mentioned just a moment ago, there are much easier, better, more powerful ways to smooth your resources, i.e. transfer resources around amongst the various spheres that your deck may contain. Again, I haven't seen anyone use these cards in years. So, were they powerful and necessary at the time? Yeah, I remember waiting for the song that I needed to come out for whatever sphere. Like, oh my god, it's 3 adventure packs away. That's 3-4 months. I've got to have that card. Nowadays, song schmong. Never use it. With that said, Radagast, you mentioned rose-colored glasses. Man, are they strong for me when it comes to Radagast. Love the character. Not sure why, really. Probably just because I liked the Eagle deck at the time. Playing another Astari that's permanent was probably pretty cool back in the day. I think he's another character that deserves a remake, in that I think, he'd be a little bit more powerful in today's card pool than he is, but I still think he's decent. With every release of a creature ally, he becomes better and better. The problem is there aren't a ton. But he certainly could be good, and I think just the act of playing an Astari character is kind of fun. And then we get Shadow of the Past, which, I think have been some valiant efforts to defend this card, but generally speaking, neutral from the lens of 2016, almost 2017 in a couple of hours, Radagast is the only one with any staying power, and even then, sad to say, not the best mix here.
Yeah, so when I think about the songs, I think about the same thing that I said about Dunedain Signal and Dunedain Cash, where eventually we just see heroes or characters that kind of come with some sort of resource transferring or sphere smoothing effect where you don't really need to run the songs anymore because those other cards are just always taking care of it for you. You don't so much have to rely on the luck of the draw to pull a song as you're just kind of relying on a character to do the same exact thing for you. Radagast is interesting. We don't see a lot of creatures apart from the eagles. There's the Rittermark's finest, and certainly we see more and more of those over time. But for the cost, Radagast is just really asking a lot for not doing that much. He's a very cool character, but again, it's just slightly impractical once the card pool starts to expand. He's just not quite strong enough to really, kind of find a spot in most decks. And if you're not running like a really eagle-heavy deck, and I don't honestly know if there's enough strong eagles to really make that something worth doing, he just might not end up finding a place. But the songs are fine. They served a very important purpose back in the day. And, of course, Shadow of the Past is kind of the one event among the ally and then the 4 different attachments where it's not exactly like critical, but it can do some kind of interesting things in the right context. So a lot of these cards are kind of utility focused, and I like that, they are pretty much welcome anywhere. It's not like, well, this is a neutral card, but you really want to be playing it in a spirit deck or something like that. They are very general, and I definitely do respect them for that. But I suppose that's really all I can think to say on the basis of spheres. So in moving forward, let's think for a moment about traits. And I just realized that I have been using my laptop mic to record since I did not reset it.
So, as I switch to my correct microphone, let's go ahead and talk about traits. At this point, we've covered that each of our 4 spheres of influence, at least to some extent, has started to establish an identity, and that they follow certain patterns, themes, and trends. But something else that we see are traits, and sometimes they're kind of inclusive to one sphere, like eagles only show up in tactics, but the same cannot necessarily be said for others. Like Rohan, for instance, is primarily spirit, but we also see some in lore. Gondor we see in spirit and lore and leadership and tactics. So in the core set, we kind of saw a smattering of cards with all sorts of different traits, like Barivor and Aragorn were Dunedain characters and ranger characters. We saw some Gondor, like Eleanor, Denethor, some allies, such as Guard of the Citadel and the Gondorian spearmen, and then Rohan, we have Theodred, Eowyn, Dunehir, and then we also started to see some dwarves. So we, of course, got Dane Ironfoot in the Mirkwood cycle, but before him, we had Glóin, Gimli, Thalin, the Veteran Axehand, Brock Ironfist, and more. We got one Noldor elf in Glorfindel, the lore hero, and we got one Sylvan elf in Legolas, the hero. But then we also got allies like Silverlode Archer and Lorien Guide. So Shadows of Mirkwood introduced 2 new Hobbit heroes, 2 new Gondor heroes, a Dale hero, and a dwarf. There was no Eagle or Rohan hero, but I mean, what are your thoughts? It's a strange question to ask, but what are just your thoughts overall on traits at this point in the card pool?
Yeah, they're non-existent, frankly, and that was by design. The original designers of the game designed cards with sphere in mind, not so much trait, which is weird in a way because we do get trait cards in this particular cycle, and that is far and away how I prefer it, which is maybe just because that's how the game started. You couldn't really build a Rohan deck and reach 50 cards without non-Rohan cards, and that goes the same for dwarves, certainly, but also arguably the only other semi-developed trait, which is eagles. There aren't enough eagle things to make a 50-card deck. So certainly the game has changed in that it's all about traits. It's all people want to play. For the most part, if someone's talking about a thematic deck, they really mean a trait deck. They're almost synonymous in this game. Although I will say that what is deemed thematic is a debate amongst players, and maybe something we could talk about someday. With that said, I'm much more of the school of I'd rather have a fellowship of Middle-earth races in my decks that are a smattering of this or that or the other, and I find that to be thematic, but most people define thematic, again, as traits. So the early life of the game, it just really isn't that possible. And yeah, you could throw all the Eagle cards in a deck, or yeah, you could throw all the Rohan cards in a deck, but the decks really aren't going to work. Until much later when where traits really become the focus, and in dwarves are the first trait that really gets fleshed out, really to the exclusion of all others for quite a while. So at this point, I don't really think the decks are viable, but dwarves will be very soon.
Yeah, so in the core set, it almost seemed like traits were just there to provide a little bit of like flavor or just to add some, character to the cards. Stuff for ages is totally useless and arbitrary. Like, so many characters have noble or warrior or scout, even archer, Bjorning, craftsman, minstrel. And those don't do anything for the longest time. Some of those traits never see any development, and some of them, it takes years of card pool expansion before we see, anything useful happen to them. There are some exceptions, like For Gondor gives all characters an attack bonus, and then if you've got Gondor, it also gives you some little, generally, not very often used defense bonus, so it just seemed like traits were totally a second thought, and that's why it did seem a little bit strange that the Mirkwood cycle did focus pretty heavily on Eagles and Rohan, but then we kind of see those kind of get left by the wayside, and for a long time, dwarves jump into the spotlight, but then it's like, is it actual synergy, or is it so much that, if target character is a dwarf, then they get this ability or something like that? It almost just seemed like a restriction as opposed to like, you really want to use this kind of character. So just traits as a whole are definitely kind of strange. I can't fault the core set for giving you like a little sampling of this and that, like a little, tour of Italy or something from Olive Garden, where you just get to try out a little bit of everything, but, it is what it is. So, in moving forward, I look forward to experiencing again the power of dwarf decks, and over time we start to see Gondor kind of come into its own. Rohan certainly get more tricks and just tools, instruments to kind of power up their arsenal, and in a very modern card pool, we start to see like the different elf traits become strong, and certainly that develops over time, where deluxe expansions really inject a lot of power into one specific trait. But just like you said, for a long time, the design team was very much just focused on making sure that the spheres kind of had their own identity, as opposed to like, tactics focuses on combat, spirit focuses on questing, but we see the Rohan trait in both of those spheres, and those characters, have a lot in common. So I just look forward to the future when our card pool expands, but in kind of wrapping up our opinions here of the player cards, I suppose, Matthew, for the progression series, it's really our only point of reference, but what do you think about just the core set player cards as a whole?
I think I'll reiterate the point that I made earlier, which is, with every new adventure pack that came out, we kind of threw those cards in our deck because we needed to get to 50. It was very difficult to do so otherwise. You and I both owned 3 core sets very quickly, but you don't really want to draw a second or third copy of Celebrian Stone, for example. And so we needed other non-unique cards to throw in our deck to help us reach 50. But most of the new cards that you subbed in didn't really help your deck all that much. I'm probably going to have a very similar outlook for Khazad-dûm, although it diminishes a little bit with each successive cycle. But I really feel like it took a while for the vast majority of the player group to say, now, finally I can deck build. Certainly at this point in the game's life, we couldn't. You couldn't even really make a monosphere deck that was very good. Dual sphere was maybe a bit better because you could include only the power cards and keep out the rest. But again, as we've mentioned, there weren't that many power cards even for a dual sphere deck. So I think this is the disadvantage of the living card game format in general, particularly this one, where half of every adventure pack or so are encounter cards the players cannot use. The card pool just grows so slowly that it's really going to be a while until there are lots of options. And so, certainly I appreciate some of these cards, but the vast majority of them just do not have staying power.
Yeah, I can certainly echo that about pretty much all of these cards. Do you have any thoughts about the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle specifically that differ at all from the core set?
Generally speaking, I think the cards in the core set are better than the cards in the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle. When I think of sort of staple heroes, my mind goes to the core set and how many of those we still use. Shadows of Mirkwood, how many of those do we still use? None, really? Maybe Frodo, but even then, I don't see Frodo used a ton anymore. Eowyn, though, I see almost any time I play the game. And not just because she's in my deck, but I see other players want to use her too. Legolas is still good to this day. He did just get a new version in the most recent deluxe expansion, which I'm eager to try out. I haven't yet, but, the core set version of Legolas is still used. Even Gimli is used to some degree. I think Eleanor in a 3 or 4 player game is still quite effective. Again, Shadows of Mirkwood, what can we really say about those cards? Some of them are decent, the utility bland vanilla cards, but by and large, I don't think it's the best cycle of the game. And in fact, it's probably the worst.
It kind of pains me to say it, but
Yeah.
I agree with you. It very much seems like the core set introduced, it was kind of the entree, the centerpiece of your meal, and then if you wanted to experiment or sample something different, then the Shadows of Mirkwood did offer a few things to kind of change stuff up. If you didn't necessarily like Glowin, maybe all of a sudden Song of Mocking made you reconsider that deck. So not so much swapping out Citadel Plate, but just trying something a little bit different. But certainly they don't necessarily withstand the test of time. In one of our videos, someone left a comment, and I thought this was very interesting. In going back and looking at all of these old cards, you and I hold ourselves to using the most modern version of the FAQ. And one of the just critically important pieces of errata contained in that document is the Horn of Gondor being nerfed from when a character leaves play to specifically when a character is destroyed is when that generates a resource. And I just think it's kind of fascinating how much weaker the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle seems, because there are so many cards like Ride to Ruin is discard a Rohan ally to do this. The Rittermark's Finest is discard to do that. Eomund is when he leaves play. And all of those effects are so much less offensive if you're getting a resource somewhere when they do leave.
Right.
So it just seems like that one nerf has pretty dramatic effects on the value of the Mirkwood cards. But somebody asked a question specifically for this episode. Do you feel like these cards are worth purchasing today? Like if somebody's got access to the full card pool, do they just skip Shadows of Mirkwood?
You know what's interesting is I've been thinking a lot about this question, not knowing that it was posed, although I feel like I saw a comment in one of our YouTube videos that maybe asked this question. So maybe it's what you're referring to, or I'm just crazy. But with that said, probably the number one question asked on any Lord of the Rings LCG forum is, I'm a new player, where do I start? And part of me wants to say, well, just Google it because it's been asked 1,000 times. to be completely blunt. But with that said, it's particularly now that the game's a couple years old, it's a very relevant question. And the vast majority of responses, if you were to go to BGG or the FFG forums or what have you, are start at the beginning. And I think there's one major problem with that, and perhaps one minor problem that's a direct answer to your question. The major problem is that cycles go out of print, and it takes a little bit of time for FFG to reprint them. They always will. So just because it's the first or second or whatever cycle, things do get reprinted, just not right away. So sometimes the first cycle isn't available, and it might be reprinted, and you have to pay astronomical prices on eBay or Amazon or something to get the out-of-print packs. They will come back, so don't ever pay astronomical prices. With that said, again, the general response is start at the beginning. And I think that's because that's what all of us did if we've been playing since the beginning, like you and I have. But I don't know if that's the right answer anymore. Because let's say that you want to join with your local play group at a friendly local game store. They're probably going to have most of the cards, or at the very least, they're going to want to play more modern quests. If you only have the core set in Shadows of Mirkwood, I hate to say it, you're not adding anything to the quest, and you're probably holding the team back because the encounter deck with that extra card that you're triggering is going to be wrecking the board state, and you're not helping keep up with it. So I don't have a fully formed thought on this, but I really have been ruminating on it over the past couple of days, and I honestly think if you're going to jump into this game, you need to jump in with a much newer cycle. Because, quite frankly, power creep is real. And the modern card pool or the modern cycles are much more powerful than the older ones. And so, yes, there's something to be said for playing in the same order that all of us original players played in, but that's not to say it's the correct one. And so if you want to hit the ground running and play with a play group, then I do not think Shadows of Mirkwood is the place to start. Get the core set and, one of the past 2 or 3 cycles. Now, if you're just playing by yourself, playing solo, which is a draw for lots of players, I see nothing wrong with starting with core set and Shadows of Mirkwood if it's in print and doing it that way. But again, so I guess I've got 2 answers to that in summary. One, if you're playing by yourself, sure, why not? You're not going to know that these cards suck because you don't have any other cards. But if you're playing with other people, absolutely skip Shadows of Mirkwood and likely even skip Khazad Doom. But we'll save that discussion for another day.
Sure, and really the only opinion I have is just make your judgment based on what your play group is interested in. If your play group is just one person, yourself, do whatever you want. Maybe you could go through the entire card pool, chronologically, progression series style. That's totally one way to go about it that I personally am fond of. But if you're going to the local shop and they're playing the latest stuff, just understand that indeed power creep is indeed a thing. And, Boromir without some ridiculous attachments and events to make him into a powerhouse, if you bring him to the table, the sad reality is you're going to be disappointing your other players if you just can't kind of keep up with the nuclear arms race that the encounter deck is kind of bringing upon us players over time. But, Matthew, now that we've talked about our player cards, let's touch on each of our scenarios briefly. So we've got 3 quests from the core set, we've got 6 quests from Shadows of Mirkwood. I'll go ahead and provide a real brief synopsis of each briefly, and we'll kind of touch on whether or not they're fun, whether or not they're difficult, whether the mechanics are a good abstraction of what they're meant to represent, whether they're memorable, whether the scenario is totally exploitable and you can turn it into a joke, and then we'll just also touch on replayability. So, whether or not you think the player cards are worth purchasing these packs for, are these just good, memorable, fun, enjoyable quests that hold up over time. Maybe you don't want to absolutely steamroll them with a modern full card pool, but if you go back and tackle them with just kind of a goofy deck or something like that, are they still worth revisiting? So, our very first introductory scenario is Passage Through Mirkwood. It's kind of a 3 quest phase affair. You start off with a pretty benign location that actually helps you, and that you travel to it, you ready a character, and really the only thing unique about it is that there are 2 different options for quest phase 3. So it's kind of the quest that a lot of players, myself included, cut their teeth on, but I guess, what do you think about it as a scenario?
If perhaps there's any quest that brings out nostalgia for me, it's this one. I don't know why I love this quest. There's no reason to. It's fairly vanilla, although I do like the branching random quest stage that you mentioned. I don't know. There's something about it that I just love. Maybe because it's the quest I've played the most, whether it's doing it a million times for the progression series or, back in the day when we only had a couple of quests and trying out all the spheres, using it to introduce the game to new players. I just love this one. So I don't know that it's an objective opinion so much as it's subjective, but this ranks probably my top 5 for no reason other than just unbridled nostalgia.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't necessarily think like, hey, let's all play Shadows of Mirkwood. Like, that's going to be a...
Well, when you play the modern quest and get your ass handed to you time after again, I always joke, Passage Through Mirkwood? Yeah. We never play it. But no, I agree with you. But God, something about it I just love.
Yeah, I've just got so many good memories of teaching new players how to play through this scenario that as much as I might try, which I can't even begin to try, I just can't say anything wrong about it. It's the quest that most people are going to play more than anything else because it's the introductory scenario. And even back in the day when LOTR LCG was it's not exactly a simple game by any means, but it was much less complicated than it is now. Even the fact that it has 2 different ends to the quest is just very cool. Like, why not make the quest everybody's going to play a million times have a little bit of, built-in replayability to it? Certainly, sometimes it can be a bit of a bummer if you really want to fight Ungoliant Spawn and it just doesn't happen, but it's a nice introduction to LOTR where, on the first turn, maybe you reveal Ungoliant Spawn and Chieftain Uftak. So it's a cool little card. It's a cool quest. There's not really too much you can do to exploit it, I suppose. Just make sure to try to avoid that when revealed effect from the spawn. But it's a cool card, and kind of the only unusual thing about it is the Spiders of Mirkwood encounter set that's got some really nasty encounter cards built into it, ends up kind of reappearing in future scenarios. And eventually I feel like that's something we kind of stop seeing, where like the big boss monster, you don't necessarily encounter it in other quests. But, talking about nostalgia, how about Journey Along the Anduin? So that's the Hill Troll quest. Quest phase 2 is that there's no mandatory engagement. You're just kind of cruising down the river, and then at the very end, everybody reveals 2 cards from the encounter deck, and you kill all the enemies to win. What do you think about that one?
Well, this is probably, if I can speak for most players, their favorite of the core set, but not mine. Like I said, I like to be the underdog. Passage Through Mirkwood for the win. What I will say about this particular quest, however, is it has staying power long beyond others. And what I mean is probably not what you're thinking. A lot of players use this to test their decks to see if they're any good. I don't test decks. I know mine are gold. Why this quest has staying power for me, however, I think is psychological. The Hill Troll has 30 engagement cost. So if your threat is 30 or above, that guy's coming down and probably wrecking your whole team. So a lot of us were conditioned very early to build decks with a starting lineup of less than 30 threat, so not to have a first or second turn Hill Troll engagement. I think that is an unnecessary guidepost today, but if you look at folks' decks, a good chunk of them, even today, 2016, 5 years later, almost 2017 in a couple hours, we still build decks that have a 30 or less starting threat, and I think that's unnecessary, particularly with with the modern card pool. So I think of the 3 original quests, this is the one that has the most staying power. 1, because lots of people test their decks against it. But 2, again, psychologically getting smashed by that hill troll time and time again sort of conditioned longtime players to build their decks in such a way as to avoid this sort of encounter, and I don't think that that's as necessary anymore. Is it a fun one? I suppose. It was interesting, it was different, it was a challenge, whereas Passage Through Mirkwood in many ways was not, but it does not rank amongst my favorite of the original 3.
Yes, I will say if Passage Through Mirkwood is where players cut their teeth, Journey Along the Anduin is where players tended to experience their first many losses, where they'd hit that 30 threat really early on, the hill troll would come down and smash them to pieces, or it would just boost up their threat enough that eventually they would hit 50, and they just couldn't do it. For a solo player, it was like a nightmare trying to even conjure up enough attack power to kill the hill troll, and then if you were able to somewhat easily do that, maybe you were playing so much, tactics or whatever that you just really struggled to overcome locations. So back in the day, it was certainly a pretty difficult quest. It is certainly neutered over time, but like you mentioned, just conditioning players. For the longest time, I was one of those one deck to rule them all people where basically out of sheer laziness, because Octagon didn't exist and I didn't want to, dismantle and reassemble, build a deck every time I, sat down to play LOTR LCG. I just wanted one deck that was basically able to take on all comers. So, because Journey Along the Anduin was one of our quests, I wanted to make sure that I started well below 30 threats so that I didn't have to deal immediately with the hill troll. But eventually, it became much easier once you had like a hero that could absorb an attack of up to 7 if the hill troll gets a nasty shadow card. The more effects like Feint that we get once we start to get Winged Guardian, it can absorb 5 damage, and then you're only gaining 1 threat from the hill troll's swing, so it becomes much easier over time, but certainly a lot of memories of just being beaten to pieces by the hill troll. But eventually, Vassal of the Windlord, cards like that do make the quest much more simple. And then last but not least, from the core set, scenario a lot of players have a love-hate relationship with is Escape from Dol Guldur. Right. Randomly, one of your heroes is the prisoner face down. You've got to collect the 3 objectives. You've got to defeat or elude the Nazgul of Dol Guldur, escape from the orc guards, and you've got some pretty severe limitations on being able to play one ally per round. What do you think about that one?
Well, this is probably the quest of the original 3 I've played the least, in part because, frankly, it's not solo-friendly. I really like it. It's the most different. It's very unique compared to the other 2 quests. I mean, it's, I think, unique compared to the remaining 6 in the cycle. So I like this one a lot. And so, honestly, I probably played it more for the progression series than I have in real life, because it's not one that we think to bring out of the binder that often, particularly with the modern card pool, but it really is a quest, I think, that is made for multiplayer. So I like it a whole lot, but I understand why solo players, this is probably the bane of their existence.
Yes, I think if there's anything remarkable about this is that it did kind of really hold up for a very long time. People would say like, oh, you've got a really strong solo deck, but can you consistently beat Escape from Dol Guldur? Mm-hmm. And there's just so many random elements, like which of your 3 heroes is the prisoner? And we had a lot of players that would approach it from like, well, I'm going to just pick which of my heroes is the prisoner, because if it's just random, I'll, automatically lose a third of my attempts or something like that. And when you begin the game with those 3 objectives in play, if you get like 3 the Necromancer's Reach, that's easy. But if you get like Ungoliant Spawn and 2 King Spiders or something, then you're just bound to get absolutely wrecked. So it's a very cool quest. It's certainly very, very different. It gave us like a good little taste of just how complicated scenarios could be, because Passage Through Mirkwood, totally easy, but Escape from Dol Guldur, it's like, okay, when do I want to pick up this objective? Which of these objectives do I want to pick up? Okay, at this point, the prisoner gets flipped over. At this point, the Nazgul comes down. Certainly in replaying the quest, it seems a little bit more flawed than I remember, where it's like, okay, I'm going to pick up this objective after the end of the round so that I don't incur a point of damage, and I'm going to take this objective now so that the Nazgul comes into the staging area after questing, and there's some stuff you can kind of do to cheese the action windows. But it was a very cool quest that kind of stood out for a long period of time. And the only other thing I can think of to say is it features these little orc guards that are like the top card of your deck that you put down in front of you. And I don't think a single time ever playing that scenario I've like killed one of those little orc guards. It's always just been like a mad dash to success. Mm-hmm. But I suppose now that we've covered our core set, let's break into the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle. First up is the Hunt for Golem. You find those clue objectives, the Signs of Golem. A player has to have a copy of an objective to quest. If you lose all of your clues, the quest deck gets reset to Phase 2. The clues can get shuffled in. The Hunters from Mordor get stronger based on how many clues are out. What are your memories there?
So we waited a long time for this quest. Not only was it caught up at customs once, it was caught up at customs twice. And so we had to wait an inordinately long time to get this quest. And then it was sort of meh. It could be so interesting, but in many ways, like a lot of these early quests, it's super swingy. If you get, 2 Hunters of Mordor or Hunters of Mordor and a clue in your initial staging or two, this quest can be an absolute beast. But if you don't really see any hunters and just get a crap ton of clues, then it's not that bad. So I appreciate what they were doing. It is different. It sets the stage for the rest of the cycle with Golem, and I like how it sort of recurs, and we have little side quests as we go along. But for the most part, it's not really a replayable quest. So it's sort of an inauspicious beginning to the cycle.
I think maybe more so than most quests, this is one that definitely depends on the luck of the draw. And I know that my opinion of this quest is very positive, but I totally understand why a lot of other people have a much more negative or middling experience with this, just based on the order that the cards are turned. Hearkening back to the original progression series, you and I experienced the Nightmare scenario where it was like, a hunter came out, and then another hunter came out, and then like the next 15 cards were Signs of Golem or something like that. So on the first turn, you've got this like 6 or 8 threat and attack value enemy or enemies sitting out there in the staging area, and that can make this scenario just absolutely brutal. Just because of sheer dumb luck, the order which cards came off the encounter deck, a lot of my play experiences have been incredibly harrowing and memorable, but if I played this game more often than I do, like generally my experience playing the game is limited to when I'm recording a video with Matthew here, I would probably have more experiences where it's like, okay, a bunch of locations came off the encounter deck, and here are a bunch of treacheries, and here are some enemies that don't really do anything, or maybe here's like one hunter from Mordor that attacks for 2 or for 4, and then I just forest snare it or something like that. So it's kind of a goofy quest. It's kind of another imperfect execution where you don't want to pick up the clues until you absolutely have to. If memory serves, the Hunters from Mordor as a shadow effect deal damage to a character that has a clue attached. So if you don't pick up the clues, you don't subject yourself to potentially taking damage and having the clues shuffled back into the encounter deck. And then of course, when you and I most recently played through the Hunt for Golem, that was like the first time I've ever had the kind of negative play experience where you're ready to finish the scenario, but it just so happens that treacheries show up that, strip away the clues, so that it's not like a challenge, it's just kind of frustrating because you want to win, but you just can't because mechanically you don't satisfy whatever requirements. But still, moving on, let's talk about conflict at the Carrack. So this was very difficult back in the day. 2 quest phases, Quest Phase 2, 4 unique named trolls come into play. They all buff one another when they're engaged with players, whether they're increasing attack or defense, or increasing threat, or shuffling sacked cards back into the deck. Of course, you get to potentially enlist the aid of Grimbeorn the Old, an objective ally, but how does that one hold up?
Well, I would wager that this is probably the favorite of the cycle for many players. And it's also our first appearance of an objective ally, Grimbeorn the Old, as you mentioned. I love objective allies in almost any quest, and he certainly is a fun one. I'd love to try to recruit him to the player's side. So I enjoy this one. Not my favorite, but it is definitely a good one. In again, many ways, the highlight of the quest. Lots of fun battles, an objective ally to recruit. There's a lot to like about this quest.
There is a lot of cool stuff going on. It was definitely one of those scenarios that at first it seemed very difficult just because players weren't really used to pacing themselves when it came to questing. Like, you really generally want to take your time with quest phase 1, because if you progress too quickly, then all the trolls come out and you're not able to deal with the giant amount of threat being added to the staging area. Then your threat hits 34 or higher, all of the trolls kind of swarm you at once. If you don't get Grimbeorn, it is way more difficult. And of course, if you've got hill trolls out benefiting from the troll abilities as well, that makes it much more difficult. During this most recent playthrough for the progression series, I mentioned that I'd never had the sacked and roasted slowly combo actually go off before. So again, it was cool that, the designers wanted to kind of harken back to the Hobbit novel where there were these trolls, they were stuffing the dwarves into sacks, they were arguing whether they should roast them or boil them or sit on them one by one and squash them into jelly or whatever. So it's cool to see that can happen, but it's just not very often that it does. One of the most difficult things about this quest for me was back in the day, we only had access to winged guardians, so that frightened beast treachery card was horrific in that, maybe you're adding 8 or 10 to your threat. So it's a cool, memorable scenario, but it's definitely a little bit, I don't want to call it boring, but it's just you want to take it as slow as possible and get yourself into the best possible position to just smash the encounter deck. So it kind of rewards that turtling play style. And it's just kind of, it doesn't hold up quite as well as I remember. But next we've got one of maybe your personal favorite scenarios. So, Matthew, why don't you tell us about A Journey to Rosgobel?
Personal favorite, I hate this one. Just kidding, it's my favorite. So we get another super cool objective ally, although honestly, Williador doesn't really do much for the players, but basically we got this eagle who's wounded, and we've got to heal them, and it's a race against the clock. So you've got to collect the Othalos, there's a ton of nasty treacheries, and you've got to get the eagle to Radagast's house, and the eagle needs to get fully healed. Now, I will say lots of players don't like this quest because they feel you have to really specifically deck build for this one. Well, I've got some news for you folks. This is a deck building game, so of course you have to build a deck to beat the particular puzzle that you are facing. So this is one of those quests that really wrecked the one deck to rule them all mentality that so many players had at the beginning and even have to this day. I read a post the other day on BGG, a random side note, about should I get into this game if I don't like deck building, which just flabbergasts me, but I suppose in the age of net decking, i.e. finding decks on the internet and just building them, I suppose it's possible. But with that said, this game is a puzzle, and you are constantly trying to solve different puzzles, and I like that. It keeps me stimulated. It keeps things fresh. You can't use the same strategies to always win, and I think this really was the first quest, maybe Escape, but of the cycle, the first quest to really demonstrate that. You do have to take a different approach, and so I enjoy this one highly. I still think it's fun. I think it's replayable. I love the tense sort of race against the clock. Williador can be taking damage left and right. So I'm a fan. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I will say, as one of those, one deck to rule them all players, something else I used to do is I always used to play scenarios blind the first time. So I'd assemble the encounter deck, I'd assemble the quest deck, I wouldn't read any of the cards. I would just, kind of shuffle up and deal. And the first time I got to quest phase 3, and I automatically lost because, of course, I didn't have enough Athelas gathered up, that was the last time that I ever did that blind play, just because I do not care for losing. Even when it wasn't on camera back in the day, it was still too frustrating to tolerate. But it's a lot of fun. It is really the first time where it really pushes players in the direction of, okay, one thing's been working great so far, but why don't we mix it up a little bit? Maybe every player wants to include Spirit in their deck. Maybe you didn't like Eleanor very much back in the day, but maybe you should not ignore her when it comes to this scenario, and maybe you do want to play her just because exhaustion and everything else is just absolutely catastrophic if that is left to resolve unchecked. This introduced like Forest Grove akin to bee pastures and whatnot, where you could kind of find your objectives. Eventually, Shadows of the Past comes out, where you can, maybe explore Forest Grove to get Athelas into play, and then you can put the Forest Grove back on top of the encounter deck. I don't know if it necessarily holds up over time. Like, back in the day, there was really only that Lorvim Lodris that was like a strong method of healing Williador, but eventually it's like, as healing cards came out, I just remember thinking every time, like, oh, it's another way to heal Williador. Oh, it's yet another way of healing Williador. This makes A Journey to Rosgobel easier and easier over time. So I just have nothing but respect and admiration for Rosgobel just in changing the formula that we'd seen thus far. And it was just very cool because at this point, it was almost as though LOTR LCG could just do no wrong. It was just hitting a home run each and every time at bat. But then the dark days came, and those were known as the Hills of Emmenmuil, and that was kind of the first time where I was a little bit disappointed by one of our scenarios. Yes, my bias was incredibly strong. I used to write these exhaustive Amazon reviews, and I gave that like a 4-star rating or something like that. And someone was like, Mitch, how terrible would a scenario have to be for you to give it like less than 4 or 5 stars? And I was like, okay, fine. Maybe I'm not being totally fair. Maybe I'm being unduly kind. Because when it comes down to it, it's one quest card. All you've got to do is collect 20 victory points by exploring these Emmenmuil locations. They've got a lot of nasty effects, but I hear Northern Tracker is a pretty powerful card. It's kind of a boring scenario because there's not a lot of enemies. The enemies get stronger the more locations you have in play, but you explore locations. I know that you love the artwork, Matthew, but what do you have to say about THOEM?
My memory is not the best, but the only defense of this quest that I can remember reading from anyone is that they like the quest because of the art. And they feel like they're having a real trek through Middle-earth. And I suppose if you're the type of player that likes a trek through boredom, then this is the quest for you. But if you're someone who actually likes to play a game, then unfortunately, I don't think this is the quest for you. Now, I have said time and time again that I appreciate what the designers were trying to do here. We had Conflict of the Carrick, which was a quest testing your combat prowess. We had Journey to Rosgobel, which was testing your ability to move quickly, but also heal this fun little ally, Williador. We get Hills of Wheel, which was, until this point in the game's life, exploring a phase that's not really been explored very much, which is the travel phase. And I really give them credit for attempting to make the travel phase semi-quasi, barely interesting. With that said, they failed miserably. And in large measure, for most of the game's life, the travel phase has remained the most uninteresting phase. Certainly some modern quests put some really interesting, fun twists on this. And we get some really interesting player cards that interact with the travel phase. But for the most part, this quest is just dead on arrival. You can just have endless loops of either not revealing locations or just keep getting enemies in the staging area, and so you can't win. It can just become an utter boring slog fest, and the art can't save it. So for most players, this is universally derided as the worst quest of the game. There are some ardent defenders of the art. They rarely defend the actual mechanics of the quest. But it again, I appreciate what they were doing, but I think I've only played it for the progression series, which is now twice, and then the one time I played it when it came out. It is never a quest that I will revisit. I haven't yet played the Nightmare version of it. I'm so woefully behind on Nightmare, it's not funny. I hear for the most part, even the Nightmare version doesn't make it much better, whereas the Nightmare really rehabilitates a lot of the older quests. So sadly, again, I appreciate their attempt, but this first attempt at making travel interesting was a complete and utter failure.
I think it's very interesting that our most recent play experience with the Hills of Wheel is probably the most interesting one that I've ever had. Like, I almost feel the modern progression series experience with it doesn't do it justice, where it just so happened that by blind luck we ended up having a good time, or some approximation of a good time while playing it. Right. Just because I've experienced so many times, okay, I'm going to commit all my characters to the quest, I reveal an Wheel location, I make enough progress to clear the active location, I've got 30 victory points or whatever, but there's an Wheel location in play, so I can't beat the scenario. Wash, rinse, repeat, you're done, you're ready to be finished, but you don't meet whatever arbitrary requirement there is. And of course, maybe more so than any other quest, this just demonstrates that Northern Tracker, I don't necessarily want to say it's game-breakingly powerful, but it's definitely sufficiently powerful that it just alters the way that the encounter deck had to be designed, because it was just, it's to this day is so incredibly strong. Speaking about quests that lend themselves strongly to the possibility for negative play experiences, next we have the Dead Marshes, and what was very unique about this one is it was the first time that we had some sort of unique test, and this was the escape test. So it kind of allowed Will Powers-focused characters to shine, and that they're not just questing, but occasionally you'll have to do these escape tests. You reveal X encounter cards, you compare your willpower value to the escape value of these cards, and if you have more willpower than escape value, you pass, and then Golem is an objective who's not going to be able to elude you. But that was another, treachery-heavy scenario. Golem, when he gets 8 resource tokens from failing a lot of escape tests, he vanishes into the encounter deck, and then it's just, you're totally relying on hopefully drawing Golem and getting him back into play. Hopefully he won't be discarded as a shadow card or something like that. And, my first maybe 1 or 2 experiences with that quest where I was sitting down with my brother, who never really played the game very much, and when you've got a new player who might be, you might be able to convince them to play more often, get more into the hobby. You really want them to have good play experiences. And a game went from maybe being 20 minutes and fun to, tacking on an extra 40 or 60 minutes because we had to dig through the entire encounter deck 1 or 2 times. But, what are your own experiences playing the Dead Marshes?
To me, this is the red-headed stepchild in many ways of the cycle, meaning it's the one I never remember. I remember escape tests, but I never remember what treacheries are unique to this scenario. I couldn't tell you what enemies are unique to this scenario. I really can't tell you anything about it. I think for some reason it's one that I didn't play very much of when it first came out. I remember the first four very, very well. The last two I don't remember as much, although I have more vivid memories of Return to Mirkwood than I do the Dead Marshes. So it's, to me, the one that gets lost in the shuffle. I can't say that I've hated it the times we've played it for the progression series, including our most recent time, but I understand the potential for frustration with Gollum escaping and whatnot. So I don't know. For some reason, it just gets lost to me. The other quests overshadow it for one reason or another, so much so that I couldn't even articulate what I dislike about it, other than to say it's just sort of unmemorable.
Yeah, I think it's in a perfect world, it could be a lot of fun where you build up a bunch of resource tokens on Gollum. Things are really, really close, really, really harrowing, and you just barely manage to pass that giant escape test at the very end where you have to reveal, like you deal an escape card for each resource token on Gollum. Ideally, that is really nail-biting and tense, but it just seems like more often than not, we have our most recent progression series play experience where we finished where Gollum maybe had like 2 or 3 resources on him and it was a total joke. We kind of like blitzed our way to the end. So it seems like the options for an outcome are very infrequently you'll have a really tense nail-biter of a game that's memorable and awesome and fun, or you'll experience the it's not difficult, oh my god, can this scenario please be over experience where Gollum escapes into the encounter deck and or discard pile. Or maybe Gollum escapes and then you draw him and then you're so sufficiently established that you've got like, okay, I'm going to commit 30 willpower to this escape test. And because Gollum was just revealed from the encounter deck, he's got no resource tokens on him. So I deal 0 escape cards and I pass without trying. I've got to say, out of all of these scenarios, with maybe the exception of the Hills of Emmonweal, I don't really see a whole lot of replay value just because it just seems like I just don't want to fetch it out of the, binder. Like, it was cool that for once maybe you've got some incentive to play Unexpected Courage on, like, Eowyn, but apart from that, it's just not fun enough. It's unique, but it's not necessarily enjoyable. And of course, once we got Shadows of the Past, that makes the whole Gollum getting discarded thing much more bearable. But, last but not least for the Mirkwood cycle, we've got Return to Mirkwood. Of course, that should be very fresh on our minds. It's a 4-phase affair. Phase 1 is totally vanilla, but you've got to assign a player to guard a different Gollum objective at the end of the round. He boosts his guard's threat by 3. Then you can pick a different player to guard Gollum. Quest Phase 2 is very short, but I think the player guarding Gollum can't commit characters to the quest. If you fail questing, you lose the game. Quest Phase 3, the player guarding Gollum can't play cards. And then Quest Phase 4 is all the enemies in play kind of swarm the player guarding Gollum, and once you kill all the enemies, that's game over. There are a hell of a lot of locations, hell of a lot of treacheries. There are like 6 out of the 53 cards are enemies worth remembering. 2 Hill Trolls, Ungoliant Spawn, 3 copies of Addercop. But it's kind of another solo player challenge. But, what do you think of Return to Mirkwood?
Yeah, at this point in the game's life, I was still a solo player. The local play group didn't start up, or at least I didn't find out about it until at some point in the Khazad-dûm cycle. So this is one I don't think I played very much, but it's more memorable than the Dead Marshes, maybe because of the big scary spider enemy, Addercop, maybe because of just the insane amount of threat gain that a solo player would take. So not one I've played a ton, but I think it's a fitting end to the cycle. There's some real challenge here. There's lots of things you have to balance. There's a really big, beefy, interesting new enemy with really cool art. So I don't think it's the best cycle-ending quest we've ever had, but I do think it's a nice sort of trendsetter in the sense of you get a really tough, challenging quest at the end of a cycle to wrap everything up. And it wraps up the story here of finding Gollum and returning him. So I like it better than the previous two.
I do think that just like Escape, it's very cool in that it definitely lasted as a challenge for a solo player. Just because, like you said, the threat gain was out of control, and if you play a deck that has a lot of threat reduction, you're probably going to struggle in regard to conjuring up a lot of attack strength. And if you can't handily deal with like the hill trolls and the Addercops, which automatically engage with the player guarding Gollum, then this can be a really difficult quest. My only real complaint about it is sometimes it can be really brutal if it just so happens that the wrong player is guarding Gollum because of a treachery, and then you fail the second quest phase, which thus far in my play experiences, I've been lucky enough to never have happen, but it certainly can, and if you stall on Quest Phase 3 and you can't play cards, that totally sucks. And then if you can't reduce your threat, that sucks even worse, because as soon as you hit 50, it's game over. So it's a tricky quest, especially back in the day, but I think it relies totally upon what order you draw cards in. In the classic progression series, we had a first turn hill troll, and then another really early on hill troll, and it was fun and tense because we had to deal with that like right off the bat, because back then we were using Dane Ironfoot. If you don't experience like enemies coming off the encounter deck, because it is an enemy light deck, it doesn't provide much of a challenge. It's kind of a play Northern Tracker win type scenario. If you can counter Gollum's bite and anguish, then it's not too terribly difficult, but it definitely can be difficult and memorable. But it does have kind of potential, as do any of these quests, to just be rather underwhelming. So Matthew, you've got more experience than I do, so let's get your opinion first. How do all of these first 9 scenarios kind of compare with what's available today? I mean, like, looking back, is it evident that our design team has learned much or changed much, since these beginnings, these humble beginnings?
They don't hold up at all. Unfortunately, I played one of these quests within the past year or two. In fact, it's probably closer to the 2 than it is the 1 year. And in the time it took us to set up to the quest, which is fairly time-consuming, right? Setting up quests isn't easy. You got to hunt through all the various encounter sets, etc., to make the encounter deck, and the 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes it took to do that, and you beat the quest in like 3 seconds. It's not fun. So these quests do not in any way, shape, or form hold up to the modern quest pool. So thank the modern card pool. Thank God for Nightmare Mode, which reinvigorates some of these quests. Although I'll say some of the Nightmare Modes, Hunt for Gollum, for example, still beat it first turn, or not first turn, but first try. So even Nightmare Mode wasn't hard enough. So it's mostly a nostalgic thing, I think, that I have for these quests. I love playing them progression style with the card pool that existed at the time. I think they still pose a challenge. I think they're still interesting. I think they're still fun. But if you're going to bring a modern deck to these quests, don't even bother. It's not worth the time. The quests, by and large, are simpler. The board state is simpler. There's not 1,000 triggers to remember, although even with the 1 or 2 triggers, we still forget on Octagon. But it's simpler days, simpler times. They just don't even compare to what we have today. And I'm not saying that that's good or bad. I'm just saying that don't bring a modern deck to a quest from the Dark Ages.
Right. Don't bring a knife to a gunfight or vice versa.
Exactly.
I will say, for all the more modern stuff, it's almost a little bit shocking traveling back in time a little bit. And as I always say, you've got a more modern kind of perspective than I do. But looking back on these encounter decks, I'll click on Octagon to look at the deck, and it's like the encounter deck contains 1,000 cards, and it's like, oh my god,
Right.
they're just so huge and unwieldy. And especially in the core set, it's like, well, there's 2 copies of Wargs in this 60 card encounter deck, and there's 1 copy of Warg Rider, and there's 1 copy of Black Forest Bats, and here's 2 copies of this and 1 copy of that. And it just seems like the consistency is so all over the place, in that a lot of these scenarios are wildly dependent on the luck of the draw is going to define whether or not you have a positive or negative play experience. The encounter deck doesn't really combo off of itself, whereas eventually we start to see everything get much more processed and refined, where, the encounter deck just has more theme and flavor, and it just makes a lot more sense. And you've mentioned the Nightmare version of these scenarios, and that is a beautiful opportunity for the developers to go back and kind of take a second crack at some of these old scenarios and say, like, okay, it was a giant pain in the ass when Gollum, the objective, escaped into the discard pile. How can we change that? Or a lot of players would cheese the clue mechanic for the hunt for Gollum. How can we change that? How can we make it seem like the hunters from Mordor are actually hunting Gollum as opposed to their generic enemy that is out there to kill the heroes or something like that? So things have certainly changed quite a lot over time. There aren't nearly so many encounter cards like Evil Storm that just totally whiff. Almost everything nowadays is like, this does something horrible, and if it doesn't, it surges into a card that will do something horrible. So it was certainly a much more innocent time. The board state, like you said, was far less complicated. So I suppose while it lasts, you and I should enjoy our relatively mistake-free videos. But just kind of bringing this giant episode to a close, let's take a moment to reflect on ourselves. So both of us started playing this game in April of 2011. When Matthew and I are sitting down to record this episode, it's December 31st of 2016. We are just mere hours away from New Year's. Do you feel like you've changed much as a player, like in regard to how you build decks, how you value cards, and how you strategize while you're playing?
For posterity's sake, I don't think I actually started playing until June-ish of 2011. I didn't get involved right away, but it was very, very soon after the release of the game. And I did play before Hunt for Gollum came out. That much I remember. With that said, how have I changed as a player? Certainly in terms of the progression series. Well, I think one thing that I have a much better understanding of now that I didn't necessarily understand then were action windows and when you can do certain things and when you can't. Certain things were always clear to me. For example, you can play Sword of Gondor and trigger it the same turn because there's nothing that prevents that. But that's an age-old question that gets asked time and time again. That was always clear to me because I did have experience with other customizable card games like the Star Trek and Star Wars CCG from Decipher. I'd played a little bit of Magic, the Lord of the Rings card game from Decipher. So I did have some experience with card games and timing and action window sorts of things from other games. So those things didn't bother me so much. But Lord of the Rings does have some unique timing window things. You mentioned earlier the tricks you can play in Escape from the core set. So I think I've gotten better at manipulating those kinds of things. I think earlier in the life of the game, or being a newer player, I was much less prone to experimenting with dual or even tri-sphere decks than we are willing to do so today. I also think we value heroes like Eleanor much more now than maybe we did, or at least I did, back in the original Progression series or even the early life of the game. So I think I'm a more mature player, certainly. But with that said, I still think my play style is by and large the same. I like powerful decks, whether it's a powerful willpower deck like my current Rohan deck, or a powerful orc smashing deck like any sort of tactics deck that I build. So I haven't changed so much in the types of decks that I build, but I think I just understand the way the puzzle fits, if that makes sense. But what about you? How do you think you've changed as either a player or a deck builder?
So, how I've kind of changed over time as a player is kind of interesting, and it might not be something that a lot of people can identify with, just because even though I've come and gone from the LOTR LCG community a few times, whenever I have been involved and been paying a lot of attention to the game, I've been a rather public-facing figure, whether I was on a podcast, sharing my opinion of cards and talking about play experiences with anybody listening, or whether I was recording myself and or myself with you actually playing through scenarios. So originally, I just played for fun, and then eventually it kind of became more of a duty or a role where I wanted to kind of, not like saying this out of bragging, but I wanted to kind of show off for the community. Like, oh, look, I can, beat this quest with this deck or something like that. So when I didn't have a significant number of people watching, I wasn't as laser focused on making sure that I understood the rules perfectly. Back when you and I originally started the Progression series, in some of the original few videos, you and I did make some kind of goofy timing window mistakes, where I remember like at one point I had committed some characters to the quest, and then for some reason I drew some cards, and one of them was Gandalf, and then I used sneak attack to put Gandalf into play and then committed him to the quest as well. And that's not legal, but over time I've become more and more focused on that. Part of the reason why I was kind of deterred from continuing the original Progression series was a lot of negative commentary from a select few very vocal members of that community back in the day. So kind of over time, I felt this increasing need to engage in flawless play. So whereas I was maybe once more open to trying a lot of cute stuff or combo-y stuff, slowly but surely over time, I was kind of conditioned to play stuff that's going to be more powerful, more efficient, and more practical, even if it is a little bit less exciting. Like the original Progression series kind of got some heat from the community for playing dwarf decks more often than not, because they were very strong, even if they got a little bit tedious or boring over time. And kind of building the Progression series in a way that like we have to keep, filming, refilming, doing the same video over and over again until we do eventually beat a scenario. That's a lot of planning, a lot of recording, a lot of editing. So there's a lot of work that has to go into like clearing a scenario. So for all those reasons and more, I try to be laser focused on rules so that people, aren't led astray by me or you setting a bad example, and that I'm also kind of incentivized in the interest of saving time to play very powerful stuff. But in looking back at all of these old cards, I certainly see much more power and utility where I'd overlooked it before. Like back in the day, I grossly underestimated how strong Faramir is, and even stuff like Rear Guard, all of a sudden it's much, I'm more inclined to think like, gee, maybe it was wrong for me to just dismiss that card out of hand. So it's very cool to see a lot of power where I kind of overlooked it before, and certainly my strategy while playing is all of a sudden I do pay much more rapt attention to like, okay, I don't need to grab this objective yet, or, well, technically Gollum counts as an objective ally, so we have to exhaust characters, let's exhaust Gollum. So it's just kind of like squeezing the blood out of a stone.
Right.
So I'm just having a blast going back and revisiting all the old scenarios, checking out all these player cards that a lot of players probably don't even remember, but
Right.
I wouldn't do the progression series if it wasn't a total labor of love. So I'm having a blast. I could not dream of putting an end to this modern iteration of the classic series, and I just look forward to what's next to come. So I suppose, Matthew, we may as well kind of bring this exhaustive video to a close, but any final thoughts before we kind of wrap this one up?
I'll reiterate what I've said a few times, and that is the nostalgia is strong for this particular cycle. Because of all the cycles, it's probably the one I've replayed the most, not even counting the two go-throughs with the progression series. And in some ways, it makes me sad because I will probably never play these scenarios again in this form. If I was ever to play them, it would be the nightmare mode, and certainly I probably would never play them again in a progression style with the card pool available to me at the time. Maybe I would, but there's always a new scenario to play, and I'm so far behind in scenario playthroughs and nightmare playthroughs and saga playthroughs and all these sorts of things that it really has been fun to go back and replay these, not only just to play them, but also to play them with you, Mitch. We had lots of viewers at the beginning of the restart of the progression series ask, why aren't you just picking up where you left off? And I do think that was a legitimate question, but again, I'll say that I've enjoyed playing these again, because again, I probably will never play them again, at least not in this format. So it has been a ton of fun to replay them. It's been very interesting to look at the cards with what I hope is a more nuanced, mature point of view. And I really can't wait to look at the next two cycles that I've not revisited since the progression series last did, to see if I've maybe undervalued cards that I now think are more worthwhile. Look at cards I've forgotten, because I'm sure there are many that I have. And frankly, to play quests I've not played in 2, 3, 4 years. So this has been an absolute blast. I cannot wait to record the next cycle. But what about you? Have you enjoyed our trek through Mirkwood once again?
Well, I will just say, if you think you are behind the times, Matthew, let me tell you. But no, this has been an absolute delight. A huge part of wanting to go back and have this series, cover everything from the very beginning is that nostalgia and that just deep, profound, just good memories and passion and love that I have for this game, probably more than anything else I've been involved with recreationally. I've got so many great memories of just being involved with this game when I didn't have a whole lot of other good stuff going on in my life. It was kind of what ushered me into the whole sense of internet community, where I was part of a podcast, I was meeting a bunch of people, even if it was just, through VoIP or whatever, making a lot of friends from all over the world, having people reach out, telling them that they appreciate what I'm doing. So I just have nothing but good memories when it comes to looking back at all of this stuff. I'm definitely excited for what's yet to come, and even though I kind of echo your sentiments where I'm unlikely to probably go back and play any of these old scenarios, especially because I kind of honestly feel like it's a waste of time to be playing when I'm not recording. There may come a day when we, just run some kind of cute decks against older scenarios, probably not this old, but at the very least, these videos, these recordings are forever immortalized, and, going forward, if somebody wants to re-experience with us our take on these scenarios and our experiences with these scenarios, there's the original progression series, and now there's this new version. So, I've said this before many times in private, but Matthew, I could not envision continuing the progression series without you, so I feel honored that you've joined me on this journey together. I look forward to experiencing eventually, the Sands of Harad deluxe expansion and the Haradrim cycle, even if it might take a couple of years to get that far. But I've got nothing but enthusiasm about this game. I really look forward to continuing this series no matter how busy either of us ever get. And I just want to close by thanking all of you viewers and listeners out there for being a part of this series. I hugely appreciate the warm reception that Matthew and myself have gotten. I've left this community a couple of times, regrettably, but I'm back now. I can scarcely express how much I appreciate the warm invitation back I've received from everyone. So a huge thanks one last time to everyone listening. A huge thanks to you, Matthew. And I suppose, please plug your podcast and let's get on out of here.
Well, the sentiments are certainly shared, Mitch, and to all you listeners out there, I would love it if you would join my co-hosts and I for an in-depth look at the Lord of the Rings LCG, focusing on strategy, deck building, and the metagame. We are the Grey Company Podcast, and you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and all over the interwebs. And I'll add, I've not been on the past couple of episodes, but hey, I'm still a member, and I will be joining an episode of the Grey Company Podcast soon. So please check us out.
Definitely. So check out the Grey Company. Be sure to leave your comments below, sharing your own sentiments, opinions, play experiences, all of that good stuff on any of the scenarios or player cards that we've talked about in this exhaustive episode. Thank you so much one last time for joining Matthew on this big discussion. Up next, we're going to be tackling our first print-on-demand scenario, the Massing at Osgiliath, and then thereafter, we're going to be cracking open Khazad-dûm, taking a look at the player cards, playing through those initial 3 scenarios, and then it's off to play the Dwarodelph cycle, and then before long, we're going to be in Saga expansion territory. So feel free to reach out, get in touch with me. I'm the Hive Tyrant on Twitter and Facebook. If you want to donate to support the ongoing progression series, I'm on Patreon as well. But as always, thank you so much for listening, and be sure to tune back in again soon for much more LOTR LCG content to come, and take care.